The judge looked at my father and asked, "Mr. Lawson, are you saying your daughter gave you $100,000 and never expected it back?" My father didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor." Across the courtroom, my mother lowered her eyes. I sat perfectly still, because 2 years earlier, that same man had promised me that money would be returned within 12 months, and he had made that promise while my son was fighting for his life. My name is Linda Harper. I was 63, living outside Franklin, Tennessee, and I had never imagined sitting across from my own parents in court. I wasn't there because I hated them. I was there because I had finally learned that love doesn't make a signed agreement disappear. My son Daniel needed a kidney transplant. He was 38, married, and the father of a little girl who still called me Grandma Linda. When his kidneys began failing, Daniel tried to act brave. One evening in the hospital, he looked at me and whispered, "Mom, don't spend your retirement on me." I told him not to worry, but I was worried. My husband had been gone for several years, and the savings we'd built together were supposed to carry me through old age. Then my parents came to my house. My father brought his worn leather folder. My mother brought a casserole. Dad sat at my kitchen table beneath the clicking ceiling fan and said, "Linda, we need to borrow $100,000. I stared at him. "For Daniel," Mom added softly. That was the moment they knew exactly where my weakness was. My son. Dad promised they would repay me within 12 months. He wrote it down. He signed it. Mom signed it. I transferred the money. 6 weeks later, Daniel received his transplant. I remember sitting in my car afterward, holding a paper cup of hospital coffee while rain struck the windshield. My boy had survived. I thought the money would come back. It didn't. At 12 months, Dad needed more time. At 18 months, Mom said I was being selfish. At 2 years, my father stopped pretending. I went to their house and asked for my money. My mother stood behind the screen door. "You gave us that money," she said. "No," I answered. "I loaned it to you." Dad stepped behind her. "You can't prove that." I didn't argue. I went home, opened the old filing cabinet, and found the signed agreement. Then I found the bank transfer. Then the messages. But beneath those papers was one document I had completely forgotten about. I read it twice, and suddenly, I understood why my parents had been so confident I would never take them to court. The document was a photocopy of a handwritten note my father had made before I transferred the money. At the top, he had written Daniel's name. Underneath it were 3 numbers, a date, and one sentence that made my hands go cold. "Linda will do anything for her son." I read it again. Then a third time. I sat at the kitchen table with the old coffee maker humming behind me and listened to the ceiling fan clicking overhead. I wasn't hurt because my father understood that I loved Daniel. Any parent would do almost anything for a sick child. What hurt was realizing he had apparently calculated how much that love was worth. I called Susan Miller, a local attorney recommended by a woman at church. I brought her every document I had, the signed agreement, the bank transfer, the messages, and that handwritten note. Susan read everything without interrupting. Finally, she looked at me and said, "Linda, this isn't just about whether you remember lending them the money. We need to establish what they intended when they accepted it." I nodded. "Can we?" "We'll find out." She sent my parents a formal demand for repayment. 3 days later, their response arrived. They denied the loan completely. According to their attorney, I had given them the money voluntarily because I wanted to help my son. I remember staring at that sentence until the words blurred. My mother had watched Daniel recover. She had hugged him after the transplant. She had told me how proud she was of me. Yet now they were using his illness as proof that I had willingly surrendered my savings. Susan noticed my expression. "Don't call them," she said. "Don't threaten them. Don't explain yourself to relatives. Let the records speak." So I followed her advice. We requested the bank records connected to my parents. Then something unexpected appeared. My father had moved several assets into my mother's, named shortly after I demanded. Repayment, a rental property, a vehicle, part of a parcel of land. Susan circled the dates with a pen. "Linda, these transfers happened after you asked for your money." I looked at her. "Why would they do that?" "Because someone may have expected you to pursue repayment." That answer sat heavily with me. They weren't simply refusing. They were preparing. That evening, my brother Mark called. "Mom says you're suing them." "I'm asking for my money back. They're our parents." I looked at the documents spread across my kitchen table. and I'm their daughter." He went silent. Then he said something that made me stop breathing. "Linda, Dad told me that money wasn't yours anymore." I didn't answer Mark right away. I could hear the refrigerator humming in my kitchen and, somewhere outside, a lawnmower moving slowly down the street. "What did Dad tell you?" I finally asked. Mark took a breath. "He said the money became family money once you gave it to them." I closed my eyes. "Mark, that's not what the agreement says." "I know that now." His voice had changed. It wasn't defensive anymore. It sounded tired. "Linda, there's something else you need to know." I waited. "I didn't know they used your money." My eyes opened. "Used it for what?" Mark hesitated. "My business." I sat down. Mark had started a small construction company a few years earlier. It had struggled after a bad season, but I had never known how serious things had become. "How much?" I asked. "I don't know." "Mark," he exhaled. "Almost all of it." I felt my fingers tighten around the phone. My parents hadn't borrowed my savings because their money was temporarily tied up. They had borrowed it because my son was sick. They knew I would say yes, and they needed money to keep my brother's business alive. I asked Mark if he had proof. He said he had something at his house and would bring it over. 40 minutes later, his pickup pulled into my driveway. He walked onto my porch carrying a brown envelope. I opened it at the kitchen table. Inside were bank records and copies of invoices from the months after Daniel's transplant. There were payments to Mark's suppliers, overdue bills, and a large transfer from my father's account into Mark's business account. I looked at the date. It was less than a week after my $100,000 transfer. "Did you know about this?" I asked. Mark shook his head. "Dad told me it was his money." I believed him. But then I noticed something tucked behind the invoices. A bank receipt. It showed my father had withdrawn a substantial amount from his own savings just days before he asked me for the loan. I looked at Mark. He had money? Apparently. My hands went still. That changed everything. My parents hadn't been desperate. They had protected their own savings while taking mine. Susan studied the receipt the next morning and immediately requested the complete account history. 2 days later, she called me. "Linda, you need to sit down." I knew from her voice that this wasn't about my parents anymore. "What did you find?" She paused. "Your father didn't just move your money into Mark's business. He made another transfer after you demanded repayment." "To whom?" "Your mother." My stomach tightened. Susan continued quietly, "And Linda, that transfer happened 3 days after your father told you they weren't paying you." I stared at the wall. Then Susan said, "There's one more thing. The account they moved it into wasn't your mother's ordinary account." "What was it?" "An account neither of your parents had ever told you existed." Susan slid the bank statement toward me and said, "This account was opened 8 months before Daniel's transplant." I stared at the page. My mother's name was on it, but so was my father's. The account had been opened quietly, without either of them ever mentioning it to me. I looked at the deposits. At first they seemed ordinary. Then I saw the amount that made my heart stop. $100,000, my money. It had been transferred into that account 3 days after my father told me they wouldn't repay me. I looked at Susan. "So they moved it after I demanded it?" "Yes. Why?" Susan folded her hands. "That's what we're going to find out." We requested the remaining records. I spent the next several days trying not to think about it. I went to church on Sunday, bought groceries afterward, and sat in my car outside the supermarket for nearly 10 minutes before driving home. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was simply trying to understand how two people who had raised me could look at their own daughter and decide she was someone they could take advantage of. Then the records arrived. Susan called me immediately. "Linda, your father made a mistake." I drove to her office. She showed me a deposit made into that hidden account before I had ever transferred my money. It was only $7,500, but the description beside it stopped me cold. "What does that say?" I asked. Susan pointed to the transaction note. It read, "Reserve for Linda." I looked at her. "That was written before the loan?" "Yes." I felt the room grow strangely quiet. They had apparently created an account connected to me before Daniel's transplant, before my money arrived, and before they ever claimed they needed my help. Susan continued, "There's more." She showed me a series of notes attached to later transactions. One said, "If Linda asks, say funds are tied up." Another said, "Keep agreement out of discussion." I read those words twice. My father hadn't simply changed his mind about repaying me. He had anticipated that I would eventually ask. They had discussed what to tell me. I sat back in the chair. For 2 years, I had wondered whether I had misunderstood my own parents. Now I knew I hadn't. Susan prepared everything for court. My parents' attorney argued that the money was a gift. Susan presented the signed agreement. They claimed the agreement was informal. She presented the bank transfer and my father's handwritten acknowledgement. They claimed they had spent the money on family needs. She presented the records showing it went into Mark's business. Then she presented the hidden account records. My father finally lost his temper. "She's our daughter," he snapped. The judge looked at him and calmly replied, "That doesn't answer the question." My father went silent. The hearing was postponed for mediation. That evening, my mother called me for the first time in months. Her voice was trembling. "Linda, please. Your father wants to talk." I expected another argument. Instead, she whispered, "He says we may lose everything." I sat quietly. Then she added 6 words I never expected to hear from my mother. "And he says we need you." My mother said, "And he says we need you." I didn't answer immediately. I could hear the old clock ticking above my kitchen doorway. 2 years earlier, I would have dropped everything. I would have driven to their house, listened to my father explain, and tried to find some way to keep the family together. But I wasn't that woman anymore. "Mom," I finally said, "you needed me when Daniel was sick. I helped. Now you need me because you don't want to face the consequences of what you did." She went quiet. "Linda, we're your parents." "I know. Don't you have any love for us?" I looked through the window at the porch swing my husband had built. Love isn't the question. I ended the call and contacted Susan the next morning. She told me my parents were offering a settlement. They would repay the $100,000 through a documented payment plan secured against assets they still owned. In exchange, they wanted me to dismiss the case once the agreement was signed. I read every page. I asked questions. I changed 2 terms Susan thought were reasonable. Then I signed. My parents signed too. The first payment arrived the following month. Then another. There were no apologies at first. Just checks and paperwork. I preferred it that way. Months later, my father finally called. "Linda," he said, "I handled things badly." I sat quietly. He continued, "Your mother and I were trying to protect Mark." Looked down at the final repayment statement on my desk. "You protected Mark with my money. He didn't deny it." "I know." That was the closest thing to an apology I ever received. My brother Mark eventually came to my house himself. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets. "I should have asked questions," he said. "Yes," I told him. He nodded. We didn't hug. We didn't pretend everything was normal. But over time, we began speaking again. Daniel recovered well enough to return to work. His daughter grew into a teenager who still called me Grandma Linda. One Sunday afternoon after church, Daniel sat beside me on the porch and said, "Mom, you know you didn't have to fight that hard for yourself." I looked at him. "I wasn't fighting your grandparents." He waited. "I was protecting the woman who had spent her whole life protecting everybody else." That evening, I watched the sunset over the quiet road and thought about everything my parents had taught me. Some lessons came from love. Others came from betrayal. I had lost money for 2 years, but I hadn't lost myself. My parents eventually paid every dollar they owed me, the family, didn't return to what it had been. And perhaps that was for the best. I learned that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting, and love doesn't require surrendering your boundaries. I had spent years believing keeping peace meant staying quiet. Now I knew better. Sometimes the most peaceful thing a person can do is tell the truth. Keep the evidence and finally say no. Family may deserve our love, but nobody deserves our silence when they do us wrong.